The courtroom was a cold, echoing chamber of judgment and indifference, its high ceilings and marble pillars doing little to hide the ancient scent of fear, injustice, and silent desperation soaked into its very structure. And as 17-year-old, Jamal Bryant sat shackled to the defense table with a quiet dignity that only those hardened by a lifetime of being unfairly judged could understand. He felt not fear, but a deep, simmering betrayal, the kind that sits heavy in your bones when the country that promises you justice instead makes you a target. He wore a clean collared shirt, his khakis pressed, his sneakers spotless, his posture rigid, his eyes lowered. Not because he was guilty, but because he was exhausted, worn from the weight of being a young black male in a country that didn't bother to separate his existence from suspicion. And as he scanned the room from beneath his lashes, he saw nothing that resembled fairness. Just a sea of white faces in official uniforms and robes, an uninterested public defender who hadn't bothered to remember his name, and an arresting officer, Officer Kenneth Brody, who sat smugly, arms crossed, spinning lies with the confidence of a man who knew the system would always side with him. Jamal had been stopped while walking home from the library, falsely accused of stealing a cell phone from a local electronics store, his backpack thrown open, his body slammed into the concrete, and his protests ignored, even as surveillance footage no one had yet bothered to examine, would prove that he had been nowhere near the scene at the time of the alleged crime. And now, in this room that claimed to represent truth and due process, he was watching his fate be decided by people who had already made up their minds. The prosecutor was vicious, speaking of trends in urban youth behavior and patterns of resistance, painting Jamal as a threat with nothing more than stereotypes and statistics, while the judge, a graying man with spectacles and the demeanor of someone perpetually inconvenienced, watched with bored disinterest, only occasionally glancing up from his notes. And as the court recessed for a 10-minute break, the tension didn't ease, it only thickened, with murmurs flitting through the gallery like a swarm of flies feeding on rotten assumptions. Jamal sat motionless, chained at the wrist, his lips pressed into a firm line when Officer Brody, already emboldened by the courtroom's silence and the judge's passive tolerance, began marching toward him, his boots striking the floor like war drums. And before anyone could process what was happening, he stood over Jamal, glowering with hate and frustration, his jaw clenched, his eyes wild with contempt. And then, because Jamal had dared to shake his head earlier at one of Brody's blatant lies on the stand, because Jamal had looked him in the eye as if to say, "You will not break me," Brody raised his hand and struck the boy across the face, hard, with a sharp, open-palmed slap that echoed like gunfire in the silent courtroom. The sound cracked the air and shattered the pretense of law like glass under a hammer, and Jamal's head snapped sideways, his cheek swelling instantly, blood blooming on his lip. But he didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even flinch. He just sat there, stunned but unmoved, the sting of injustice more familiar to him than any physical pain. And as the audience gasped, journalists in the gallery scrambled to adjust their cameras, their flashes flickering like lightning in a storm of outrage. And the bailiff, stunned, hesitated, eyes darting between the officer and the judge, unsure of whether he should intervene or stand down, while the judge, most damning of all, did nothing. Not a word of reprimand, not a signal for order, not a flicker of outrage at the assault of a restrained minor in his very courtroom. And as time slowed into surreal stillness, every breath in the room caught in suspense, every eye trained on the teen whose dignity had just been violated under the blind watch of the law, Jamal sat frozen in that moment, not because he didn't want to react, but because he understood what would happen if he did. He knew that the world didn't grant black boys the right to anger, even when struck, even when bloodied, even when caged like animals in spaces designed to parade them as criminals before proving a single fact. And he clenched his fists beneath the table, swallowing the heat in his throat, refusing to let them see him broken, refusing to let his humanity be stripped so publicly, so easily. Then, suddenly, like thunder shaking the earth, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom creaked open, loud and deliberate, the hinges groaning like they too had seen too much, and every head turned, drawn to the silhouette that emerged through the backlight, tall and regal, his gait measured, his expression unreadable, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals in full-service uniform, and as he stepped into the light, the temperature in the room shifted, the energy electrified, and gasps once again filled the air. But this time not out of horror, but out of stunned recognition. Because the man who entered was not just anyone. He was Justice Richard Bryant, a towering figure of American jurisprudence, one of the most powerful legal minds on the United States Supreme Court. And he was also, in this most crucial and personal moment, Jamal Bryant's father. And as his presence settled over the courtroom, like divine judgment, Officer Brody's face drained of color. The prosecutor shrunk into her chair and the judge nearly dropped his gavel, rising shakily to his feet with a strained stammer. "Your Honor, Justice Bryant." "This is highly unusual." But Justice Bryant didn't respond immediately, didn't acknowledge the judge or the officer or the press. He simply walked slowly, methodically, toward the defense table, each step radiating power, grief, and controlled fury. And when he reached his son, he gently placed a gloved hand beneath Jamal's chin, lifting it to examine the wound, his jaw tight, his voice low and composed, but sharp enough to slice marble. "Are you hurt, son?" And Jamal, eyes wide, shook his head slightly, whispering, "Not enough to stop me." And something shifted in his father's gaze then, a flicker of pride, tempered by sorrow, and he turned to the room, his booming voice rising with the clarity of 100 courtrooms, echoing with the weight of a man who had authored opinions that changed the course of history. "This is what justice looks like in your court. A child assaulted, lied about, humiliated under oath while those sworn to uphold the law stand idle." And he raised his hand, pointing directly at the officer. "You may wear a badge, but you wear it without honor. You may have the law on your side in this room, but I am the law in this nation's highest court, and I will not let this go unchallenged." A wave of shocked murmurs broke through the silence. Reporters whispered furiously into their microphones. The judge began to sputter a defense, but Justice Bryant cut him off with a single look. "This court is adjourned. I will be filing a formal complaint with the Circuit Oversight Committee. This judge is suspended from the bench pending review. And Officer Brody," he said, turning toward the now silent officer whose earlier arrogance had completely drained from his posture, "I suggest you retain counsel immediately, because what you've just done is not just immoral, it is criminal." As his words settled over the room like a final gavel strike, no one moved, no one objected, not even the judge. Jamal stood slowly, and for the first time in the trial, the cuffs were removed. The people in the courtroom, once dismissive or indifferent, now watched with a mixture of fear, respect, and shame. And as father and son walked side by side out of the courtroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind them, it was clear to all that this case was no longer just about a mistaken identity. It was about the soul of the justice system itself. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with the chaos of reporters, clerks, and law enforcement officials, trying to piece together what they had just witnessed, but none dared approach the stoic giant, who now led his son through the storm with quiet strength and solemn resolve. For Justice Richard Bryant, distinguished Supreme Court Justice, constitutional scholar, and widely regarded as one of the most feared legal minds in the nation, had transcended the role of father and judge in that moment and become something more, something timeless, something that stood in direct defiance of every institutional injustice laid bare in the courtroom behind him. And as he walked with his hand gently but firmly resting on Jamal's shoulder, he carried not just a boy, but a broken system on his back. And though Jamal was silent, still processing the surreal descent of his father into the courtroom, the tremble in his fingers betrayed the emotional quake that rocked through him, because he hadn't seen his father cry since his mother's funeral 7 years earlier. And though Justice Bryant's face remained composed, beneath the surface raged a storm of biblical proportion. Rage at a system that had nearly swallowed his only son, at a courtroom that had condoned brutality and deception in its sacred space, and at himself for believing, even for a moment, that his station could protect his family from the venom that still pulsed through the veins of American justice. And as they emerged into the light, flanked by U.S. Marshals who cleared a path through the swelling crowd, microphones thrust forward and flashbulbs popping like fireworks, Justice Bryant stopped at the top of the marble steps, turned to face the mob of journalists, and with one raised hand silenced the chaos before speaking with a calm fury that resonated deeper than any prepared statement. Today, a sworn officer of the law assaulted a restrained minor in open court under the watch of a sitting judge, and not one member of that institution intervened, not out of fear, not out of confusion, but out of complicity, he said, his voice sharp as a scalpel and just as precise. And while you may focus your headlines on the fact that the victim is my son, I tell you now, he is your son too, your brother, your future. And if this can happen to a child whose father sits on the nation's highest court, what hope is there for those who have no name, no station, and no audience? The reporters hung on every word, some scribbling furiously, others simply stunned into silence because the weight of the truth had finally become too heavy to ignore, and before they could respond, Justice Bryant turned away and descended the stairs with his son, issuing a simple directive to the marshals. Get us to D.C. immediately. And within hours they were aboard a government jet. Jamal seated across from his father in a cabin built for senators and dignitaries, staring out the window as clouds drifted by, his swollen cheek darkening like a storm bruise, while his mind struggled to make sense of how quickly his world had changed. And when he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but direct. "I didn't think you'd come," to which his father replied after a long pause. "I should have come sooner." And though the words were simple, the pain behind them was vast. For Richard Bryant had long walked the tightrope between duty to country and duty to family, believing he could protect Jamal by building a world too high for hate to reach, never realizing that hate doesn't climb. It infects, it seeps, it wears the robes of judges and the uniforms of officers. And as the plane touched down in Washington, the capital was already abuzz with news of the courtroom slap and the judicial reckoning that was brewing in its aftermath. For Justice Bryant had not just threatened action, he had taken it, filing a formal ethics complaint against the presiding judge, submitting video footage captured by court journalists, and triggering an emergency review hearing with the Judicial Oversight Commission, a move that sent tremors through the legal world, for it was rare, if not unheard of, for a sitting Supreme Court justice to take such direct action against a lower court in an open forum, and rarer still to do so on behalf of a family member. But Justice Bryant understood now that the illusion of impartiality could not exist when justice was bleeding in public, and the time for silence had long passed. And in the days that followed, America bore witness to a slow, painful unraveling of the courthouse in question. The judge placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation, Officer Brody suspended without pay as Internal Affairs opened a criminal review, and new details began to emerge, details that revealed a troubling pattern of racial bias in that courtroom, including past cases where young black and brown defendants were overcharged, mistreated, or silenced under dubious conditions. And as the media devoured every headline, Jamal tried to navigate his sudden transformation from anonymous teen to national symbol, receiving letters from strangers, invitations to speak at rallies, and even hate mail from extremists who believed justice was a privilege reserved for whiteness. But through it all, his father remained his constant, guiding, teaching, shielding, and most of all listening for the first time in years, really listening. And one night, as they sat in Justice Bryant's study beneath towering bookshelves, filled with volumes of constitutional law and civil rights history, Jamal asked, "Why do they hate us so much?" And Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, hands clasped, brow furrowed in the way that meant his answer would not be simple or soft. "Because the lie of superiority can't survive when truth stands upright," he said. "And your existence, your mind, your potential, your dignity, it threatens that lie." And Jamal nodded, not fully understanding but beginning to see that his pain was not isolated, that it was rooted in centuries of systems designed to erase him. And in that moment, something shifted between father and son. Not just reconciliation, but alignment, the passing of a torch not in ceremony, but in crisis. And Jamal began to study the law, to read his father's old cases, to ask questions about the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, qualified immunity, and the limits of judicial power. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted to understand the battlefield he'd been born onto, And as the days turned into weeks, the case against Officer Brody gained traction. A grand jury empaneled to review evidence not only of the slap, but of multiple complaints filed over the years by civilians and junior officers alike. Complaints that had been buried, redacted, or quietly dismissed by a department more interested in preserving image than administering accountability. And meanwhile, Jamal's former court-appointed attorney was replaced by a high-profile civil rights legal team who filed a federal civil suit against the city and the officer for unlawful arrest, use of excessive force, and violation of constitutional rights, a move that drew both support and scorn across the political spectrum. But Justice Bryant made no public appearances beyond a single televised interview in which he declared, "This is not about vengeance. This is about correction. And if the law cannot correct itself, then it will cease to deserve the trust of its people." And his words sparked national debate, congressional inquiries, and even a scheduled hearing before the House Judiciary Committee to examine judicial accountability in the wake of systemic failures like Jamal's case. And as the world debated, Jamal prepared, not just for his legal future, but for the journey ahead, for in the fire of that courtroom injustice, something within him had forged into purpose. And one night, weeks after the assault, as he stood before the Lincoln Memorial, staring up at the stone words etched into the monument, he whispered, "I see you now." Not to the statue, but to the legacy of struggle that had brought him. Here and behind him, his father approached, placing a hand on his shoulder once more. And together they stood not just as father and son, not just as judge and defendant, but as two generations of black resilience staring down the myth of supremacy and daring it to blink first. In the days that followed the explosive revelation that the black teen assaulted in open court was the son of a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice, the nation found itself caught in a firestorm of reckoning, reflection, and resistance as civil rights groups, students, educators, clergy, and even military veterans flooded the streets in protest, not just in Washington, D.C., but in dozens of cities across the country, from New York to Atlanta, from Minneapolis to Oakland, wielding hand-painted signs that bore phrases like "Justice" for Jamal, "Protect our youth," and "Accountability is justice," while crowds chanted with a thunder that shook marble monuments, "We are Jamal," echoing the undeniable truth that what had happened in that courtroom was not an isolated act of police brutality, but rather a seismic exposure of a systemic rot that had long gone unchecked beneath the surface of American jurisprudence. And, as Justice Richard Bryant moved methodically behind the scenes, coordinating with federal ethics boards, judicial oversight committees, and congressional allies, his son Jamal, though still processing the trauma of that slap and the upheaval, it ignited, began to emerge from the shadows of victimhood into the terrifying spotlight of national symbolism. And he found himself in the crosshairs of not only supporters who saw him as a hero, but critics who viewed his father's position as unfair leverage. Some claiming that Jamal was being used to advance a political agenda, but Justice Bryant remained unshaken, issuing a rare statement that silenced critics and elevated the discourse. "If standing up for my son means standing up for every young man who lacks the microphone, then I will not apologize for being loud," he declared. And with that, the movement swelled. Law schools held teach-ins about constitutional violations and racial bias in judicial spaces. High school civics teachers rewrote their lesson plans to include the incident, and prominent figures in law, politics, and academia began calling for sweeping reforms that ranged from mandatory body cams in courtrooms to the complete demilitarization of courtroom security staff. And yet, at the center of it all, Jamal remained a 17-year-old boy trying to reconcile the surreal transformation of his life, from anonymous teenager to living symbol of justice denied, and his days were filled with media requests, school visits, interviews with legal counsel, and therapy sessions paid for by his father's private funds. For while the world debated the implications, Justice Bryant knew that healing his son's internal wounds was as important as dismantling the external forces that had caused them. And quietly, he hired the country's most renowned trauma therapist, who specialized in post-assault recovery for youth of color. Someone who had counseled survivors of both police violence and wartime captivity. And in those sessions, Jamal began to speak, not just about the slap, but about the years of feeling watched in stores, of teachers who underestimated him, of the gut-punch silence when his peers laughed at racist jokes they thought he wouldn't understand. And slowly, the healing began, paralleled by a public crusade for justice, as civil litigation against Officer Brody and the city accelerated, led by a team of powerhouse black civil rights attorneys, including a former U.S. attorney and a law professor known for dismantling discriminatory policies through class action, and they built their case not only on the slap, but on years of documented abuse by the officer, who had faced 14 prior complaints for excessive force, none of which had ever resulted in punishment. And now, with the eyes of the nation watching, depositions began, and the officer's history of bias, aggression, and unprofessional conduct was laid bare in court transcripts that soon leaked to the public, fueling even more outrage as it became undeniable that the courtroom slap was not an outlier, but a symptom of long-standing protection for violent officers who hid behind the badge. And as legal proceedings unfolded, Justice Bryant made a daring move. He convened a private roundtable at the Library of Congress with judges from every circuit, inviting them not as colleagues, but as custodians of justice, demanding they examine their complicity in allowing a culture of silence. And for 12 hours, they debated ethics, unconscious bias, enforcement immunity, and the racial double standards in judicial discretion, emerging not with consensus, but with the first steps toward rewriting judicial codes that had long shielded misconduct, and simultaneously a separate investigation launched by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division began probing not just the officer, but the entire courthouse culture, uncovering that the judge who ignored the assault had been reprimanded in the past for similar derelictions, and that key prosecutors in that district had disproportionately pursued harsh penalties against Black and Latino juveniles. Facts that, when made public, caused an eruption across legal communities, leading to resignations, emergency hearings, and calls for federal receivership of the district's juvenile courts. And yet amid all this chaos, Jamal found clarity, choosing to speak for the first time on a televised town hall special, where he appeared alongside other youth who had faced legal abuse. And with a composed but raw voice, he said, "They didn't just slap me, they tried to silence me, and now I won't stop speaking." And his words lit a fuse across social media, sparking the viral Tara Slapback campaign, a youth-led initiative that mobilized thousands of teens to organize forums, vote in local judicial elections, and file formal complaints against abusive court officers. And the energy was relentless. Petitions flooded city councils, policy proposals were drafted by student coalitions, and eventually the city where the slap occurred passed an emergency ordinance banning any form of physical contact between security officers and restrained juveniles. In courtrooms, a small but meaningful victory in a war that was far from over, and all the while Justice Bryant walked a tightrope between public accountability and judicial impartiality, never presiding over his son's case, but testifying before Congress about the need for nationwide courtroom transparency laws, stating, "Justice must not only be blind, it must be visible." And that soundbite echoed across the media for weeks, showing up on posters, t-shirts, and protest art, while Jamal, now completing high school under private tutoring due to threats and safety concerns, applied for early college programs in pre-law and civil rights history, telling his father one night while they sat by the fire, "I think I want to change things from the inside." And for the first time in months, Justice Bryant allowed himself to smile, not as a justice, not as an activist, but as a father who had watched his son survive trauma and rise into purpose. And so as the civil case moved toward trial, and the federal review bore down on the courthouse like a reckoning long overdue, the nation waited, not just for a verdict, but for a new blueprint of justice that might rise from the wreckage. And in that waiting, Jamal stood taller than he ever had before, not because of who his father was, but because of who he had chosen to become: a survivor, a symbol, and now, slowly but certainly, a soldier in the war for a justice system that sees every child as worthy of dignity, not depending on who walks in behind them, but simply because they walk in at all. Months later, the courtroom bore no resemblance to the one where the injustice had unfolded. It was transformed not only by its physical presence, but by the gravity of accountability now demanded within its walls, and as people lined up for blocks to attend the trial of Officer Thomas Brodie, the man whose slap had awakened a nation. The air outside pulsed with anticipation, the courthouse surrounded by peaceful demonstrators, legal scholars, civil rights leaders, student activists, and everyday citizens who had flown in from across the country just to witness history unfold. For this was no longer simply a criminal trial. It had become a referendum on systemic abuse, on unchecked authority, on the unspoken rules that allowed officers to become enforcers of trauma instead of protectors of peace. And inside the courtroom, the energy was different than the day Jamal Bryant was struck across the face. This time the cameras were allowed to roll, the officers stood at attention without aggression, and the judge seated on the bench was one of the most respected legal minds in the region. A black woman known for her strict adherence to justice and unshakable neutrality, and as Officer Brodie entered in a rumpled grey suit, flanked by his attorneys, he no longer carried the swagger of a man cloaked in immunity. He looked smaller, diminished, the weight of his actions pressing visibly on his posture, his eyes darting nervously as former colleagues refused to make eye contact, and Jamal sat silently in the audience, flanked by his father, Justice Richard Bryant, and their legal team, his expression unreadable but his presence undeniable. And as the prosecution presented its case, complete with damning body cam footage showing Officer Brodie initiating the confrontation, falsifying elements in his report, and ultimately striking Jamal without provocation, the courtroom remained utterly silent, each frame of footage more devastating than the last, culminating in the slap that now echoed not just as a sound, but as a symbol of how quickly power can devolve into violence. And when Jamal was called to the stand, there was a collective intake of breath. He walked slowly but confidently, wearing a simple grey suit and a blue tie that matched his father's, his hands steady, his voice calm, and as he was sworn in, the weight of a nation seemed to rest on his shoulders, yet he bore it without flinching, recounting in meticulous detail the events of that day. From the moment he entered the courtroom with hope and nerves, to the precise moment he felt the sting of the officer's palm explode across his face, not as a shock, but as confirmation of what he had always suspected, that dignity for people like him was conditional, fragile and too easily stolen, and when asked by the prosecution how the incident had affected him, Jamal paused, scanning the room as though measuring every eye fixed upon him, and then he said, "I didn't ask to be made an example of, but maybe that's what it takes to change things." And in that moment the room felt different, not like a trial but like a reckoning. Like the walls themselves understood that history was being written in real time, and the defense tried, predictably, to shift the blame, to suggest that Jamal's posture or tone or silence somehow provoked the officer. But their arguments rang hollow against the backdrop of the footage, the public outcry and the sheer absurdity of trying to rationalize an act so blatantly unjust. And as the trial wore on, more came to light. A pattern of abuse in Officer Brodie's past, internal. Memos showing superiors had overlooked complaints, and a culture of silence that enabled misconduct as long as it was wrapped in a uniform. And when the jury went to deliberate, the world waited with bated breath. Networks paused programming to report live updates. Schools streamed the trial. In gymnasiums, law firms closed early to allow staff to witness the verdict. And when the jury returned, the room was so quiet, it felt like even time was holding its breath. And then it came. Guilty on all counts. Assault, abuse of authority, falsifying a legal report, and civil rights violation under color of law. And as the words echoed through the chamber, the courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in cathartic release, with cries of joy, applause, and embraces from strangers who had shared the pain of injustice, and now, however briefly, shared its resolution. And Jamal sat still, absorbing it all until his father reached over and embraced him, not with the stoicism of a Supreme Court justice, but with the open, trembling pride of a father who had watched his son endure the worst and still rise. And for the first time publicly, Justice Richard Bryant's voice cracked as he spoke, not from behind a bench or into a microphone, but directly into the room, saying, "No badge, no bench, no robe gives anyone the right to strip a child of his dignity, but when one does, it is our moral obligation to ensure the system answers for it." And those words were carried beyond the courtroom, broadcast across the world, printed on banners, quoted in legislation, etched into the memory of a nation that had for too long accepted inequality as routine. And in the weeks that followed, the verdict triggered a chain reaction of accountability. The courthouse where the incident occurred implemented sweeping reforms, including courtroom body cams, independent citizen review boards, and mandatory training in racial bias for all officers and bailiffs. Several states passed similar legislation, and federal hearings were launched to examine nationwide patterns of abuse within judicial facilities. While across America, Jamal's story became curriculum, not as a tragedy, but as a case study in civic courage, legal redress, and personal resilience. And Jamal, now beginning his undergraduate studies with a full scholarship in constitutional law, launched a foundation dedicated to protecting the rights of court-involved youth, using his platform not for fame, but for systemic transformation. And his foundation, the Slapback Initiative, opened its first legal aid office in the very district where he had been assaulted, offering free representation and psychological counseling to minors facing court proceedings, while Justice Bryant, though careful to maintain judicial impartiality, authored a landmark legal essay on dignity jurisprudence that was cited in appellate courts across the country, planting the seeds of a new philosophy of courtroom justice rooted not just in legality, but humanity. And every year, on the anniversary of the trial's conclusion, they returned, father and son, to that courthouse not to dwell on pain, but to bear witness to progress, to meet with youth who had been saved by the reforms, to speak softly in chambers now remodeled with transparency glass and accountability plaques, and to remind those who came after them that even in a system designed to break you, truth can still win if it's spoken loudly enough, bravely enough, and backed by those unwilling to let silence become the final verdict. And so, the story of a slap that once symbolized everything broken in American justice ended not in despair but in action. In new laws, in bold youth, in reformed institutions, and in the unbreakable bond between a father who wore the robe of justice and a son who wore its scars, now turned into armor. And together, they walked forward, not just having changed the law, but having changed the meaning of what it means, to be seen, to be heard, and most importantly, to be believed.